this kind of abuse of people coming up and taking a pair of scissors. There is sound to this as well. We can bring that up a little bit. Can you bring the sound up? It's the sound of cutting, but it's kind of good. This is when I get too uncomfortable. I can't stand it. Anyway, so we could be moving through the images, and the images, I'm not going to stop to describe them to them. They're pretty iconic by now. I'm sure you know many of them. But we are looking through this different way of these different visual images. And what I really want to end up with today is to say, how do we read these pictures? How can we learn to look at the photograph? The document is not merely a document. That the history that, you take a vase from archaeology, you take a little chard that's found, a piece of a vase that's found in some ancient ruin, and people create entire civilizations around that. Therefore, for me, this idea too is, how do we look at the images that have been left over of performance and not confuse them with the performance, but indeed recognize how much they suggest, how much information they carry. Learn to scan them, again, the way you're taught to do in art history, iconography, taking bits and pieces, and learn to really, really look. Use your eyes to investigate the kind of information we're talking about. And from one image to the next, of course, we learn to look at how these images say, this is 1970, this is feminism, this is exploration of the body in space, as Kanchi is doing here. This is about the way a woman takes apart a certain kind of mythology and deals with her own individual background. We won't talk here necessarily about the Breda argument, which is, of course, a very interesting one, and has a lot to do with his early work and her early work, as Donald Kuspit was talking about. But let's jump over that for now. We don't really have the moment. That's a Breda performance, as many of them were, and I think there are many examples of a good a teacher having that kind of effect. And indeed, I think Breda was left out in a very dramatic way of the Whitney show. But again, the argument will continue later, and we had the example here that this was also set up. But nevertheless, we move on to, again, artists working with their bodies, creating images. Again, let's not forget for one moment that these are visual artists. This is what happens to me every time I scan through endless pictures of what performance artists have constructed. The starting point is they are visual artists, and even when they don't think they're doing it, they come up with images that we've never seen elsewhere, images that really are strange and unpredictable, unrelated to a kind of art historical formalism, but pictures nevertheless. that come that played back into an art history. And just again plugging this point that we cannot forget for a moment the role of performance in creating the kind of work that we're looking at in the last 30 years. The early Cindy Sherman was doing performances. She would show up at parties dressed in looking like some kind of strange housewife from New Jersey in 1978 when we were all hanging out together in parties in New York. The early work was about live performance. She then decided to use those performances to construct very, very interesting photographs. And the rest is history. The photograph as we know it of the last 25 years has become this kind of dressed up demonstration, the kind of performance central, putting the figure in the middle, having nothing to do with the kinds of issues that the photographer usually thinks about, the darkroom, the lighting, the kind of those kinds of concerns. A Robert Longo moving between performance and a drawing. These endless connections between artists thinking in more than one discipline, artists thinking in the spaces between, as Serge Guilbaut was calling for, an art that has, of course, that kind of politics too, but an art that can express itself about different issues that don't come through so easily in a drawing or a piece of sculpture. And here Maurizio Catalan and his more, well, we won't talk about that, dressed up as... So as we move through this, again, just little notes of reminding you about the kinds of visual imagery in the last 10, 15 years that is coming out of the art world, that is coming again directly from live performance. The kinds of constructions and how the whole documentation idea has shifted, that we are now looking at artists who are amazingly savvy and have a sensitivity to creating pictures from performances, and they couldn't happen. They go so closely in tandem that you actually can't separate them, and yet they still function as extraordinary images. Is this about the marketplace? Not quite, not yet, although obviously there is a reality too. Performance artists need money to make their art, they need money to feed themselves, they need money to feed their families. It won't be on the scale of what was the other issues that we've been talking about. And these images, I would still rather see an image like this with the kind of tragic politics that a work like this of Tanya Bruguera carries for all of us, and have this image rather than people say, well, if you weren't there, it doesn't matter. You cannot use this image. For me, this image conveys a massive history with it, a great deal of content that we can then start to unravel. And to end with just, again, visually seductive, one after the other, pictures made that have come out of performance, that have a different kind of formality, and yes, a place in another kind of way in the marketplace. But then you go to China and you come to Mexico, where I know there's an enormous amount of performance here, and in South America, and in China with someone like Zhang Wan, turning to performance once again in this way because it's provocative, it is ephemeral, it can't be imprisoned. Often the artists are imprisoned. It is a way, as Zhang Wan called it, for self-torture. It was a way for him to actually deal with this issue of how do you take a political regime, how do you take the repression and suppression and misery of what he was as a human being dealing with, living in Beijing through the 80s. How do you turn this into a kind of artwork? And the tragedy of seeing this work and showing it actually when I was on lecture in Japan a month after the Abu Ghraib pictures were first made public was also quite shocking. And just a last image here, if we can put the sound up, of the work being made.
段英梅，女，65公斤。高氧。高低低。测量高度的呢，准备测量。对，随便测吧。
Called How to Raise a Mountain by 1 meter. And just to leave you on one more art historical note, because I think it's important, back to this idea, the old-fashioned style method of art historians, how to compare contrast and compare. It becomes very, very interesting when you start to do this with performance. Take a Chris Burden and put it next to some other full frontal, close-up violence, and all kinds of things get revealed as much about these two earlier paintings and by the way we're looking at a Burden. The two things come together. Or the ending with the seeing the Courbet with the naked model and the dressed people around them, the naked Klein, the dressed people around them. Or in this case, a final image of Rodin and Hannah Wilke. We need say no more. Just put these two pictures together, and we start to arrive at another kind of performance history, another kind of contemporary history, one that is ephemeral and yet demands our attention. Thank you.
Nos quedan 20 minutos, 15, 20. Entonces, bueno, entonces un comentario rapidísimo y en función de eso lanzo un poco preguntas para la mesa, y bueno, como quieran ir respondiendo. Particularmente ahorita con la ponencia de RoseLee, creo que hay en los mismos términos en los que he estado comentando todo, ¿no? Si aquí pareciera que el problema de la historia es cómo recuperamos la memoria de lo inmediato, la imposibilidad de recuperar lo inmediato en términos precisamente de pasado, creo, y sería un primer comentario, que en el momento en que tomamos una práctica del arte como es el performance para ver cómo escribimos historia, bueno, pues asumimos en el propio fenómeno, en el propio objeto, su condición de efímero. Esta condición de efímero, y al parecer la apuesta más en términos de estrategia de escritura tendría que ver con escribir la historia en términos del futuro y no en términos del pasado, que también hay una manera de escribir la historia por la atención con el futuro. Y aquí es interesante porque precisamente conecta con otra idea que está presente, yo consideraría, en la ponencia, que es no solo se trata de objetos, sino qué pasa cuando la historia se problematiza en términos de una viejísima conexión nietzscheana entre el arte y la vida, que finalmente se arrojaría como un elemento fundamental que plantea la práctica del performance. Entonces, hay ideas que me parecen muy sugerentes, la idea de la nueva figuración, el cuerpo como sucesión, que supone una categoría temporal distinta para historiar. En fin, hay una serie de comentarios sobre los que llamaría la atención. Entonces, en esta lógica, digamos, entre vida y la historia, lo efímero, y la historia por venir, la historia escrita en términos de futuro, la estrategia que nos propone RoseLee es dos cosas. Fundamentalmente, cómo poder entender el inicio de la historia como una historia de confidencias. Es decir, hay una clara apuesta por una escritura en primera persona, por una escritura de la historia intersubjetiva, lo cual está dada en términos de este ejemplo que dice, bueno, las mejores historias empiezan tomándose un Pernod, dijiste, por ahí creo que citaste, ¿no? Que creo que la imagen es interesante, y a través de algo muy interesante que también tiene que ver con la historia de la educación. Dice, bueno, ¿qué es el espacio de la educación como una forma de hacer la historia? Un espacio donde finalmente está la inquietud de los estudiantes, la inquietud de la gente joven, y que es un dato también que habría que explorar. Creo que es un poco nada más plantear el panorama, y un poco para abrir la discusión, en estos términos yo plantearé lo siguiente. Si estoy diciendo tonterías, corríjanme, pero bueno, estoy interpretando. Primero, creo que hay una consideración en las tres ponencias. Primero, hay una condición, por las razones que sea, cada uno ya expuso las suyas, donde en realidad el objeto de arte contemporáneo es un objeto perdido. No hay objeto, o porque está inventado, o porque está diluido en las formas del mercado, o porque estrictamente hay una práctica donde el objeto tiende a disolverse, que sería esa condición. Entonces, ahí tenemos una primera problemática. ¿Cómo hacemos historia de algo que en principio carece de objeto? Al menos pone en crisis una cierta práctica de la escritura de la historia tradicional. Las propuestas para hacerlo rápidamente es una especie de palabra reencontrada, ¿no? Cómo reencontrar la palabra, y hay 3 propuestas que están haciendo. La interpretación, ¿no? La desestabilización de los discursos y la recuperación de la práctica del arte y la vida en la cotidianidad a través de la educación. Mi pregunta sería ¿esto qué significa? Y es una pregunta para los 3, en términos, primero, de política de la escritura, de la historia. ¿Cómo se entiende esto? Si ahí tenemos un objeto perdido, si tenemos una pretensión al menos de palabra reencontrada, ¿cómo poder entender la relación entre escritura de la historia y política de la escritura? No podemos negar que la historia finalmente siempre va a construir un discurso político. ¿Y cuáles o cómo son estas estrategias a la hora que entramos en este conflicto? Sería la primera pregunta que yo les haría a los 3. ¿Quién quiere empezar?
I think it actually, for me, starts where Serge ended, saying how do we make those decisions? How do we figure out who gets left and who makes it through history, who stays? In fact, I think everybody dealt with that. Donald dealt with that as well, too. The impermanence. Some people are favored of the court, favored members of the court. Somebody finds the prince's dog and gets taken back to the palace, and his name's Leonardo da Vinci. What happens? How does the art history as we know it get made? And that, to me, is where I always stay on this precipice between disciplines, because for me, I feel I have more and more. I'm always on uncertain ground. I'm always looking for that. It's always changing. I don't ever feel secure because the work does not stabilize, and it actually allows me to look at something always in a deep, stabilized manner. I mean, I think just the Oscar Schlemmer at the Museum of Modern Art and in the renovated, if we could call it that, the modern, and you look at that work, and to me it's a work that is so full. I can't look at that work except with all this interaction, the interaction of art and life with the way that Schlemmer has constructed that, because it's really coming out of a whole performance mode that was going on at the Bauhaus. So that's my response.
You want to speak? Well, I want to respond to the general point and then say a few other things in response to the other talks. I think writing of history is part of what has been called the aesthetics of reception. It's a form of reception. I think a very good example of history writing that I happen to like is the work by the Langleys on the prominence of certain French women printmakers in the 19th century and exactly how they became prominent. So I think we have to introduce reception theory as one thing, as part of it. But I want to say something else. What's been hovering around this, at least in my presentation, and I think also in the other 2 presentations, is a concept which I wanted to introduce, but I didn't have the time because I spoke long, which is, I think, Alan Capro's very important idea of post-art and what he calls the education of the unartist, okay? It came in the 60s. And for me, these are milestone essays, and they signal the end of what I would call, quote, fine art in Joshua Reynolds' sense. And I think we are living in a period where the idea of, this idea of art that offers a special kind of experience, a certain kind of aesthetic experience, is diminishing over. There are still objects that claim to be offering this. So we're in post-art, and I suggest that really the idea of post-art makes a certain sense, and that it takes us back to what I would call the anthropological root of art. It's a certain behavior. What I'm looking at in RoseLee's is a certain kind of behavior, okay? And what is the significance of the behavior? What is the significance of behavior when people go naked, okay? There's a whole social, psychological, I don't know if nakedness impresses anybody anymore, but there it is. It's supposedly some kind of gesture, okay? Then I just want to say a few things in relation to what Serge said, some of the quotes, his Gaz guy that he quoted. I think it's very unfortunate to have scorn for the decorative, okay? I think the term decorative is not exactly pejorative any longer. I think Native American art was scorned as decorative. It's much more complicated than that. I remind you that Riegel did his major work on Roman ornament, which is quite extraordinary work as well. So, this strikes me as absurd to dismiss these things as ornamental, decorative. It doesn't mean anything. Okay, Greenberg worked for French and Company for 1 year, maximum. Okay, that's all. Secondly, I don't think he or any other critic is any under obligation whatsoever to be a spokesman for an artist's point of view. Barnett Newman wrote an enormous amount there. He said it, you can take it or leave it. I recall one artist saying that Newman's work, recent artist, I won't mention his name, he's fairly prominent, he said that it's wallpaper with theory, So without the rhetoric of transcendence, all his stuff about, the sort of Thoreauian kind of stuff and some of it, there are these paintings which are quite wonderful in some way if you want to enter into that framework. Okay, so I think Greenberg's way of approaching it is interesting. I agree completely with Oscar Wilde that in the critic as artist, that the critic can approach the work of art the way the artist approaches the model. There's a wonderful quote in the critic as artist where he gives a quote from Pater, who he says, imagine that Leonardo heard Pater saying, and he gives all this elegant interpretation, as I would see it by Pater, and he says, what do you think Leonardo would say? He would say, I was just worrying about blues and greens. I had this experience with one artist where I gave a very positive interpretation, elaborate of his work, and he got very angry at me and said, I'm just interested in my paintbrushes, okay? So, should I accept that? Once the work of art is out there, it enters, as Alloway says, context. It has all kinds of meanings, whether it knows these meanings are there or not, okay? That's one thing. That's another thing I want to say. Secondly, Kristeva's idea of the culture of revolt is a total cliche. It's a very old notion. Revolt has been completely assimilated. Okay, you can buy movies about revolt. There are revolting revolts. Hollywood's trying hard to be revolting and full of revolt. Okay, so revolt is in there. I think the bourgeois has learned what Nietzsche said famously, that if you're really powerful, you can tolerate your enemies. It's a sort of a pimple on your arm. Secondly, or thirdly, I'm not sure where I am. I don't deplore the money thing. I think it's extremely fascinating that so much money is being invested in art, or whatever we want to call this thing called art. This has to be studied. This is really very, very important. So again, the sociology of the situation is extremely interesting. The sociology of the market. Who are these people buying works? Okay, this is extremely interesting, and also this keeps the whole system going. Finally, about art form, it has changed radically, no question. You used to look at it, you could open up a simple test, lots of text, few photographs, they're usually black and white. Little text now, lots of photographs, very glisten colored. Art form has become sort of a combination of Time Out and October, all on small scale. Thank God for that. But I think it certainly reflects something about what's happening. And again, this is sociologically extremely interesting to see why this magazine has gone and why people are advertising in it, okay? And instead of, in other words, deploring these things, I think it's interesting to simply study them as a social and anthropological phenomena. Finally,
to answer?
Yeah, you will. I just want to get you. I'm picking up other things you said. You put down critics. You put down reviewers. The art form reviewers are not just promoters of art. If you read them carefully, there are rather differentiated opinions that have bothered some artists. You can look at some of the letters and so forth. Greenberg started as reviews, etc. So I will stop right here. You have the time. Incidentally, I'm not sure why you don't like cocktail glasses.
I like cocktail glasses.
Oh, you said at the end that was your last statement about cocktail glasses. It's sort of cynical thing.
If that's
you prefer beer?
No, sir. No. I thought you heard me very well because you had lots of questions about my text. So it means that you were really engaged. Thank you for that. But at the same time, the business of glass is that to break the ice, I'd like that.
You were making the metaphor.
Yes, I like that idea of to breaking the glass, but the ice, but we really have to do it. And it seems to me that I'm surprised about your kind of off about what I said, the two or three points in my talk, because we kind of tend to see the same things, though.
Yes, I agree with that.
All right, and the issue is what once we have noticed the disease, I would call it? What do we do with this? And all my point is that all those boxes that we have been living with, those disciplines, as RoseLee said, and it's true, and disciplines, it means exactly what it means. It means that you shall do what the discipline says you should do. My point is that we are at a time where the situation of the art world and the culture in general that we used to know until maybe, 10 years ago, has completely transformed and changed. And if we continue to react the same way as we used to react before, we are totally out to lunch. And my question is now, when we agree of the problem, how do we do it? I think one of my idea, and I think it's not I'm among other people, because if you read all the magazines like literary criticism right now and so on, as I mentioned, a lot of people are interested in what we're talking about contemporary art, because they realize that the image, and we are living in a society in which image is absolutely prominent and absolutely important to be able to understand and to analyze critically, not only to swallow them. Okay, so we have to have a group of people, including artists. We always say artists and intellectuals. I ban that. I say we have a group of interesting people being interested in our contemporary world and a representation of our contemporary world. We should get together and put our effort together rather than to put here and there, and to try to find a solution. And I said the vacation of revolt. I agree with you with the little what's her name, Kristeva. It's a little bit passé and so on, but it means, to me, it was interesting is that it's this notion. This need comes back in some circles, and they say, my God, yes, we forgot about this. It's needed. And students, actually, why do you think a lot of students are now completely interested in the criticize our everyday life?
I just want to say one thing.
Un momento, la última intervención, tu último comentario, ya nos tenemos que ir. Desgraciadamente no vamos a poder abrir a preguntas al público, pero me están pidiendo que si alguien quiere dejar sus preguntas por escrito, se las recogen y mañana seguimos esta discusión.